feel like I've had this idea on my mind for many months now, and I'm finally so happy to bring this jacket to life. Well, hello and welcome back to the Essentials Club. If you are new around here, I am Maddie and welcome. Today I'm going to be showing you how I made this beautiful jacket. It is actually made from a picnic rug which I got from Marketplace in about February this year. I'd been looking online for ages, or even just through op shops and thrift shops, trying to find a rug that wasn't too damaged, that kind of felt nice, had nice colors that suited my style. And this bad boy popped up on Marketplace and I jumped on it, went on a little adventure, picked it up, washed it. I actually picnicked on it a few times as well, so it probably has beer and pizza stains over it, but just adds a bit of character to it, you know? And conveniently now it is nice and cold where I live. Apologies if you're a fellow Northern Hemisphere pal, which I know a lot of you are. You're in the thick of summer and probably could not care less about a jumper, but hey, you can save this for later on when it does start to get a bit cooler. It's got some beautiful buttons down the front. I've then lined it with this cotton material, which conveniently I just had laying around. Big oversized pockets, oversized sleeves, just a general oversized fit widthways, but then I made it kind of like a cropped jacket style. I just find personally that's super easy to style up because I'm always wearing high-waisted stuff, or I can throw it over the top of my dress. I do actually in fact have a pink version of this material that again I picked up from a thrift shop, and I think I'm going to try and make like a trench coat version of this, which if that is your style as well, I'll tell you what steps you can adjust to make a longer version. Overall, she's a super cute number, pretty easy to make, and if you want to follow along, this is what you'll need to make your own jacket from a picnic rug or whatever other material you have laying around. To be honest, you could probably make this out of any material. You could use like a thick corduroy or denim, or you could obviously go with like this woolen rug style. Once you have figured out your final outcome and style that you want to go with, you can then figure out how much you need by going into the description box of this video, where I have a suggested amount of fabric per size. I would also recommend getting some lining. It helps add extra warmth. If you do go with this blanket style, it'll also help prevent it itching on the inside, and also just gives it a nice clean finish. You won't see the inner seams or anything like that, so it's obviously doable without it, but the steps that I'm showing will be working with the benefit of the lining. You will need exactly the same amount of lining as you will for the outside, so I'll have that noted in the description box of this video as well. So once you've got your material sorted, the amount that you need, you'll then need some matching thread, some measuring tape, some fabric scissors, fabric chalk, some pins. We'll also need a jacket or a button-up shirt to reference, which we will cut around and use as a bit of our basis for figuring out the measurements for our self-drafting process. I just had my denim jacket, which I roughly liked the fit of, and I made a few adjustments, which I'll talk through when we get to that step. You'll then also need some buttons. So you'll need 2 buttons for the cuff section of your sleeves, and then you'll need to figure out how many buttons you want to place down this center section. And this comes down to personal preference and also the final style that you're going with. If you're going for more of this shorter length like me, I ended up using 5. If your buttons were spaced out more, you wouldn't need as many, or likewise if you're making a longer style jacket, you might need more to fill in that space. So weigh up your options and then figure out how many buttons you need. Once you have that figured out, you'll just need your trusty old sewing machine, and then we can jump into bringing this jacket to life. For step 1, we're going to lay out our fabric and start using our reference garment to trace around and find the measurements that we need to cut out for the 2 front panels and the main back section. We'll focus on one of the front panels first, so we'll shuffle around the reference garment and tuck away the sleeves and any other areas that might get in the way when we are tracing around this front panel. We're then going to trace around this, adding all the necessary seam allowance to get it to the fit that we want. So say if you're happy with the fit of your garment that you're referencing, the recommended seam allowance that we'll be adding to most of the edges is 1 inch. If you find that the garment you're referencing is quite tight and you want it to be a looser fit, depending on how tight it is, I would add about 2 to 3 inches to mainly just the width areas. And likewise, if you're referencing something that is quite large and you want it to be a little bit of a smaller fit, I would probably just trace exactly where it is and not add any seam allowance. That way when you do sew it, it will shrink a little bit in size because of the extra length that gets hidden in the seams. So once you've kind of mapped out what you need to do to this garment to get it to a better fit, we are then going to trace around pretty much all the edges with that recommended seam allowance. And along this center one, which is this straight middle section here, we're going to at a minimum add 2 inches there, and that's because we end up folding it inwards like this here, if you can see that. So for me, I pretty much added 1 inch to all of my other areas and then added 2 inches to here. Once you're happy with all those extra bits added, trace around with some fabric chalk, trim this first piece out, and then you can use this first piece as a template for the second one. Just make sure if you do have like a particular good and bad side of the material that you have the good sides facing. That way they are mirroring each other, and then you should have your 2 front pieces all done. Then we can switch around to the back side, shuffle around your reference garment so you were just focusing on this back panel, add any extra or necessary seam allowances to get it to the fit that you want. Trace around it with your fabric chalk. This might be a good point just to double check with your front panels that everything is matching. You at least want the shoulder panels to be a similar width and the side edge to be a similar height. Make any adjustments if need be to get it to a matching point. It doesn't really matter too much if there is a difference in the armhole, as that will kind of like open up and it's not really getting joined, so don't worry too much if there is a slight difference there. Once you are happy with that, you can then start to trim it. I even just trimmed half of it and then folded over, and that just made sure it was nice and symmetrical. You can of course do that, or you can just continue cutting it all in one go. Then we should have the 2 front panels and the 1 main back panel all cut out and ready to go for our main material. Then once you've got that, we're just going to replicate all of these pieces out of the lining. So again, face each of these good sides facing onto the lining, trim out like a mirrored pair for each of them. Pop that lining aside as we don't need it until a little bit later. At least just by replicating it now, we know that they are all matching measurements. Wow, there's a lot of trucks and loud things going by. Hello. Next, we're going to lay the main back panel good sides facing up, and then grab one of the front panels and lay that good sides facing down on its matching side. Align this top shoulder edge, pin that in place, and then align the side edge and pin that in place. And we're just going to sew across there and then down that side edge and leave that armhole open. Once you've done that first side, we'll then repeat it for the second side. So grab your front panel, lay it good sides facing on the back panel, align the top shoulder edge, the side edge, sew those in place and leave the armhole open. And that means you have joined the front and the back, and you kind of have this cute little vest thing. I'm not gonna lie, I kind of did love this little step, so if I have any crazy amounts of leftover material, I might make a little cute vest. Next up, we need to create the sleeves to then attach onto the armhole area. So lay down your main panels so that it's all kind of aligned and looking how it would, looking straight on at it. Lay down your measuring tape so that it is visually measuring the height of this area, and then we'll add 2 inches for seam allowance. You'll then measure from your top shoulder down to where you would want this sleeve to finish. Again, this comes down to personal preference and where you would like it to end. You can see it's a bit long, which I kind of like in a jacket. So I measured down to pretty much just past my wrist. Essentially, we don't need to add seam allowance because we are adding length on here, and it will all end up kind of evening out later. Find that measurement, grab your leftover material. We're going to fold this material, and that height that we found of the sleeve, that is going to be the height of this. The top of that fold is going to be this top you see along here. Your length of your sleeve will be going from edge to edge, and your height of the sleeve will be going from that bottom to the folded top there. You can then cut a rectangle, which is that height on the fold and then that full length that we found. Cut a second panel out to that measurement, and that is our 2 sleeve sections ready to shape to this armhole. If you haven't already, fold that material and we are going to lay our garment on top of there so that the top of this shoulder section of the half made garment is matching the folded top of the sleeve that we have just cut out. Move it over as far as you can to the edge, and then we're just going to mirror this shape of this arm section, tracing a line that goes along this rounded edge and continuing about 1 to 2 inches beyond there, and that will just be our extra seam allowance. As you can see, it is quite a large rectangle, and even to get this oversized look, I didn't leave it as a full rectangle. I measured in about 2 inches from the end where the cuffs are added, and kind of angled from the bottom of the sleeve up there, and that just allows it to have a little bit more shape and not be too baggy. If for some reason you want it to be a little bit tighter around here, just figure out how wide you want that final end of the sleeve to be and make sure you measure up to that point. Keep in mind that you need to leave at least 1 inch of seam allowance as well, but if you like this oversized look, just take a couple of inches off that bottom, angle it up there. Now that you have this first one cut out, you can then go use that as a template for the second sleeve and trim the angles out for that. Then it is time to add this sleeve onto the arm. armhole. We'll do this by laying down our cute little vest area with all the good sides facing out. We'll then grab our sleeve, face it so the sleeve is kind of working away from what you would normally look at and laying it on top of the garment. You notice that the angle of the armhole and the angle of the sleeve are kind of angling away from each other, but that is all good. Match the top of the sleeve and the top of the shoulder and pin that section in place first, so at least you know it is nice and symmetrical from that point, and just continue pinning around. And you might need to shuffle the material to match the edges as they are curving away from each other. Pin down one side until you get to this bottom underarm section, flip it around, and then pin the other side down to this underarm section. And then we are just going to sew one line all the way around there to secure this in place. I would recommend starting down at the bottom where this underarm section is, as that will be where it is starting and finishing, and we will end up joining it up later from there. Sew around this whole sleeve section to join it onto the armhole until the point pretty much where you started. Then the last thing we need to do is just flip this whole garment inside out, and you'll see that the arm has obviously got a bit of like a flapped open section underneath there, and we need to close that up. Match the bottom edges of the sleeve, and we will begin sewing again pretty much where we were under the underarm section, although instead of going to the very end of the sleeve, we're going to stop about 4 inches from the edge. And the reason we do that is so that we have this gap here, which you can see in the final jacket, which allows us to overlap the cuff area and add that buttonhole in. So from the underarm to that end point, and that is the sleeve pretty much all done for now. You'll then need to repeat it for the other side. So again, match that top edge of the sleeve with the armhole, pin it all around, sew that one line, flip it inside out. So from the underarm to that end point. That way the sewing lines will just be on this like rug section and you won't see it underneath when we cover it up with the lining. To do this, lay down your partially made garment so that it is facing all good sides up, and we're just going to tuck the 2 inches that we've added for seam allowance in the center under, so we can measure out the placement of the pockets in line with how the final garment will end up being. You can even pin them in place so that they don't move around. Then pretty much this is down to personal preference. You can figure out how big you want the pockets, where you want them to sit. I kind of went with the top of it sitting in line with my underarm section, so I kind of mapped out where that is. I then centered an amount between finishing edge of my sleeve and a healthy amount off the edge so that my buttons can sit there and have enough space. Once you've figured out kind of where you want your pocket to sit, then we'll need to figure out obviously how wide it is. And I want the final square to be 7 by 7 inches. To give myself enough room to be able to add it on, I then added 1 inch to this total amount. So I'm going to cut my square at 8 inches by 8 inches. Whatever final width and height you want it to be, add at least 1 inch to this. Then for this little like flappy section that goes over the top, you want it to be at least a little bit wider. Add an extra inch to the width that you will be cutting the square. This top overhanging section is going to be 9 inches wide. And then again, down to personal preference for the height of it, you could have a smaller one, longer one. I ended up cutting mine at 4 inches, knowing that at least 1 inch of that will be taken away in the seam allowance. So I cut out 2 of each in these measurements, and that will be enough for each pocket and the overhanging section above. If you happen to be using a material that you know is going to fray, I would highly recommend zigzag stitching or overlocking any edges before you do move forward. Like say for the pocket, just do the outer edges. If you've got any seams that you are worried that might unravel, obviously zigzag stitch or overlock them. I found that this material doesn't really unravel, and a lot of the edges will end up getting hidden or at least sewn in place. I'm sure you can assess what your material is like and how you feel comfortable making your garment. We'll focus on the main panel of the pocket first, so figure out which end you want to be the top and fold this over about 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter and sew that in place. So you're essentially hemming the edge. Do that for both top edges of your pockets. For actually adding the pockets onto the garment, we need to place it pretty much exactly where we want it to be, and then we will fold that bottom section up again by about 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance, and just draw a line with our fabric chalk along this edge that we have folded up, and that is going to help us indicate where we exactly want to sew the line as we have folded it up with that seam allowance. Do that on both of your pockets, and then we are then going to flip the pockets downwards so that they are now facing good sides facing. And that line that we have then just drawn, we need to shift the bottom of the pocket up so it passes again about 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter beyond that line, and we will end up sewing exactly over the line that we have drawn. If it helps to indicate where this line is to sew, you can pop pins in that meet the line underneath it, or again draw a line on the pocket itself so you can see exactly where it is. We are now going to flip in the outer edges of that pocket by about, again, 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance, just so that when we sew this line across there, that is already in place and folded. You'll see that I have flipped the side edges just along this area, pinned it in place, and then again pinned across this line where I want to sew. That way it helps secure this fold that we are then going to create when we fold it back up. Well, I'm saying fold a lot and I really hope that makes sense, but hopefully you seeing what I do here makes sense as well. Sew across there, making sure that those two edges folded inwards. Repeat that for the second pocket. Now you can flip the pockets back upwards pretty much to where they will be sitting, and you'll see that the bottom has a nice clean edge that you can't see any sewing line. The side edges have already begun the fold because we sewed that in place. Now all we need to do is continue tucking in those side edges completely up to the top, and that is just creating like a hidden hem underneath. Pin this in place so it is directly on the jacket of where you would want it to be placed. And I didn't really bother ironing this at any step just because it's so thick and I don't even know if the iron will work. If you're working with the material where the iron does work, of course use that. It always helps keep folds in place as we are sewing. If you're lazy like me, just pop some pins in there and it does end up working out. Then you just sew from the bottom up to the top on each of those sides. It's obviously leaving that top edge open so we can access the pocket. Just be careful. We are getting to the point where we are starting to add folds. So we are sewing where there are many layers of this thick material. I'm pretty sure I did snap a needle at this point. So if possible, make sure you have a needle that can handle thicker materials. I normally just go for one that literally says denim needle, or I even use that side swivel section if I find that I am going over quite a thick piece, like especially down this bottom where there is like 4 different layers. I just literally hand swivel it back and forth to do even the back stitch and the first few stitches. That way I am self-guiding the needle in and it's hopefully not going to snap at me, and then use the foot pedal to then sew the rest of the line where you feel like it is going to be a bit kinder to you. I did end up breaking 3 needles making this, so I will warn you of other areas where I break needles. Cool, so then you should have that first pocket added on. Repeat that for the second pocket for the second pocket where you fold the 2 edges inwards, creating that like hidden hem section. Sew up both of those. Then that is essentially our bottom main pocket panel all done. Figure out the bottom edge and the 2 side edges, and we will just fold them all in and hem them in place. Now where we lay this down with the good side facing up and exactly where we would like it to end up being, and then we fold it upwards this time so that the good sides of this panel and the good sides of the material end up facing each other. Shift it up by about 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter, pin it in place, and then sew pretty much as close as we can to that edge. Once you've sewed along both of the edges, fold them back downwards so they are facing pretty much like this, and we are going to push them as flat as we can, pop some pins along there, pretty much just sew about 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter from that top edge. That will help keep the flap downways and also hide that raw edge underneath that seam. Repeat that for both sides, and that is your pockets attached and looking cute. Now we pop that almost made jacket aside and we are going to switch our focus back to the lining and pretty much just repeat all of the steps that we have done just by joining it. I'm just going to do a quick overview. If you want a deeper dive, obviously you can go back and watch the steps which went over these how-to moments. So lay the main back panel good sides facing up, match it with one of the front panels good sides facing, match the top shoulder edge and the side edge, sew them in place. Again, repeat this for the second front piece, laying it good sides facing, match the shoulder edge and the side edge and sew down them. Then we will replicate the sleeves based off our last measurements that we found, which was the height and the length that we wanted it to be. Cut out 2 rectangles at these measurements on the fold, replicate the curve of the armhole, match the top edge of the sleeve and the top edge of the shoulder, good sides facing, pin down along there until you reach the bottom of the armhole for both sides, then sew 1 line attaching the sleeve to the armhole. Repeat this for the second side, and then face the whole garment inside out and sew the bottom of those sleeves good sides facing so that you close that bottom section. You can also use the reference of your existing sleeve from this jacket to make sure that it is all matching lengthwise, widthwise, and that little gap that we left at the bottom. So once you've got that all matched up, we then have the separate lining and the separate jacket pretty much ready to attach to each other. And how we do that is we will get the lining inside out. And then the main part of the jacket with the good sides all facing outwards, we'll then tuck the sleeves of the lining into the sleeves of the jacket. Now we want the bad sides facing each other at the moment, because at the end we want the good sides of the lining and the good sides of the jacket to be facing outwards, which means the bad sides end up facing. Once you've kind of got that shuffled into a place where it feels comfortable, we're just going to focus on the neckline and pin some key points, which includes the shoulder seams, the very tips of the jacket and lining, and also just the center section. We're then just going to sew 1 single line which attaches the lining and the jacket at this neckline. So sew across there, and that will help just secure it at least in one point and won't shuffle around from there. Lay the jacket back down with the lining facing upwards. I just went around and kind of like pulled from the neckline down to the bottom, making sure it was all nice and flat and mirroring each other. Once I was happy with the placement of that, I popped some pins, again some key points just so it wouldn't shuffle around. For me that was like the underarm section, just like midway points between the main panels and the lining. And once that kind of looked like it was all matching, I then trimmed the bottom of the lining so it is about 2 inches shorter than the main jacket material. By cutting the lining shorter, we do end up joining it, and it ends up pulling the front of the jacket inwards, and it just saves us creating a hem later on. So if you had just roughly cut the length of this jacket, this might be a good point to throw it on and just make sure it's sitting where you would like it to. Pretty much where it is now without anything done, it will end up being about an inch shorter, which is what we should have added for seam allowance anyway at the beginning. If there is any differences that you want to make, this is probably the time to make it. Once we've done that, we're going to take out those pins now that we just put in to help us figure out the flatness of it, and we are then going to flip it all around so the good sides of the bottom of the lining and the good sides of the jacket are facing each other. This does involve having to push the sleeves kind of inwards, and I think if you watch my bikini DIY video, someone pointed out it's called like, I'm gonna forget, it's like a baguette or a croissant or a hot dog method. I don't know, one of those foods. Focus on 2 lines that you want to have good sides facing. Pin it all in place again in key areas, sew across there, and then you kind of tunnel all the inside areas outwards, and you have a clean seam and you don't see any sewing lines. Again, I'm going to sound like a broken record here. We then lay it down flat so that we are looking at the facing, and again just pull it so it is more matching. Again, you might like to put some pins in some key places to hold it in place, but you'll notice now it is pulling the outside of the jacket kind of inwards by a little bit, and we're just going to sew just past that outer material and on the lining, and that is just going to create this bottom hem section, and we'll also just hold it in place so that it doesn't just shuffle around and create like a bulged effect down the bottom. So essentially it's a top stitch that just holds it in place. So that is one main area that we are adding the lining to the jacket, and then the second area that we are directly attaching it is on these little gaps that we created in the bottom of the sleeve. I found it easier if I flipped it all kind of inside out and I focused on the lining section. It's quite messy when you're looking at it when it's not finished, but essentially we're going to create like an inner hem where we fold them towards each other. Individually you kind of hem them and then they end up sitting on top of each other. So once you've figured out the placement of all of that, pin along there, and then we're going to sew down one edge across the split and then back up the other edge, joining the lining and the main material at this split. Section of the sleeves. We're going to measure the end of this sleeve and we'll add 1.5 inches, and that's going to be enough for seam allowance and also that little extra overhang length that will allow for this button. So that is going to be the cutting length of our cuff, and then we need to figure out the cutting height or width of it. I want mine to be 2 inches, so I'm going to double that to 4 inches and then 1 inch for seam allowance, so that means my cutting width is going to be 5 inches. So whatever final width you want your cuff to be, double it and then add 1 inch for seam allowance. We're then going to grab our excess material and cut out out 2 rectangles at these measurements. Once you've got them all ready, then fold them good sides facing, and then just pin and sew down those 2 short side edges, leaving that bottom long edge open. Once you've done that, flip them so the good sides are now facing outwards. And we're going to do that method where you just face the good sides of the cuffs with the good sides of the sleeves, but we're only going to pin and sew one of the sides of the cuffs. So pretty much separate the 2 long edges and only attach one of them, leaving the other edge kind of separate, and we'll deal with that after. Start at one edge of the split of the sleeve and pin the whole way around, and you'll notice that there is obviously that excess that we have allowed, and just leave that to kind of hang off for now. Pin that, sew it, and then we have the cuff pretty much half added on. So that separate edge that we didn't sew on, we essentially fold one little hem and then place it over the top so it is blocking that seam that we have sewn and you can't see it anymore. And then you just pin that the whole way around, continuing to fold it in and then hang it over the top of the seams. And then you'll notice that edge again that has that little bit of extra length. We then just completely fold both sides inwards to create inner hems, sew all the way around until the very end of the cuff. You'll then just repeat those exact steps for the second one, and then we should have our cuffs all added and looking cute. We'll come back to finishing them off when we are down to the buttonholes and the bottom section. Now we switch our focus to the center, and we're just going to pretty much create some oversized hemmed edges. You'll notice that the neckline is kind of raw at the moment, so we want to start off by creating a hem which is about 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter along this top neckline area, which will get hidden under these oversized hems. Then focus on the center section and create first small fold, which again is about 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter, and then an oversized fold which is probably about 1 to 1.5 inches depending on how much seam allowance you have. Pin that top section so that all the folds are ready and in place there, and then continue pinning and folding all the way down to the bottom of the jacket along this center line, and repeat that for the second edge. I found when I was sewing this that it made more sense to start at the bottom and work your way up and then sew across. So if you have that ability to access that, I would recommend doing it that way. Again, there's going to be some super thick areas here. I did snap a needle, I'm pretty sure, at one of these points, so you might need to hand swivel the edge so that you can prevent that when you are doing your back stitches and maybe your first few stitches. Start at the corner, go across that bottom edge just so it helps secure that edge in place. Turn the corner, go all the way up to the top, and again turn the corner and then just go back across that top edge and to the center. Once you've done your second edge, then we are up to adding the collar. I kind of find this no different to the steps of adding this cuff section in. So again, we will measure this neck hole area. This comes down to personal preference of how you would like the collar to finish. You might notice on jackets that you have at home that the collars finish a little bit in from the edge, so when you overlap it they're kind of meeting each other, or you might notice that the collar goes to the very edge of some jackets. Figure out the kind of style that you want. I went to pretty much the front center of both edges, measure from point to point of where you would like the collar to finish, and then we're going to add 1 inch seam allowance to that measurement. Then we need to figure out how high we would like the collar to be. I went for quite an oversized look. I think I ended up cutting mine at about 5 inches wide, knowing that 1 inch of that will be lost in seam allowance. If you want quite a smaller one, you can probably go 3 inches. Just to make it a little bit more confusing, we are actually going to add another 3 inches onto the length of this measurement. The reason why we add the 3 inches is because we will end up angling it back down into that measurement. That was the full length plus the 1 inch. So that will be our cutting length, and then we've got our cutting width, and we'll cut out 2 rectangles at these measurements. Fold them so that it helps us find the center point, and from that center point we'll measure out half of that measurement, which was the collar length plus the 1 inch. For me that was about 10.5 inches, and pop a mark there and draw or cut an angle to the corner. So then the bottom edge ends up being that original measurement that we found, and the top edge, which we angled out to, is that longer length. You can have this as a straight pointed tip, or I ended up curving this little corner there. So again, another little decision you can make based on what style you're after. So once you have your collar all measured out and the angles created, we are then going to lay them good sides facing and pin across the 2 angled edges and a longer top edge and sew along there, leaving that bottom shorter edge nice and open. Then, like we did with the cuffs, we are going to lay the good side of the collar with the good side of this jacket and pin them in place, but only attaching one side of the collar. So separating them so that you leave one side unattached, one side is being pinned and sewn on there. If you want this to be symmetrical, I would highly recommend folding the neckline and finding the center point, as well as folding the collar and finding the center point of that, matching them up first, again only adding one side of the collar to the jacket, and then pinning from that center point out to each edge, sewing that in place. do the same thing where we fold a hem on that edge that isn't attached to the jacket and then place it over the top of the seam that we have just created. Pin it in place so that it covers the whole neckline and collar edge, and again just sew one simple line or top stitch across there so that it finalizes the collar onto the jacket. I would recommend going around the edge of this collar and doing a top stitch that just helps keep it together and hold it flat and make sure that it doesn't kind of puff out. Once you have done that, your jacket is pretty much all done, and we are down to the final step of adding the buttonholes and the buttons in place. Lay down your jacket so all the good sides are facing up. Pop down your buttons where you would roughly like them to sit, just so you can get an idea of what you would like the final placement to be. Then start at the top button and grab a pencil or a fabric chalk, and we're going to pop a dot above where we would like the top button to be, and then a dot underneath that button, and then we'll draw a line between those two dot points, and that's going to help us indicate where the final buttonhole needs to be cut and therefore where we need to sew a frame around it. Keep in mind what we are currently drawing on is going to be where the buttonholes are, therefore that goes over the top of the buttons. I found that there was a particular side that I liked more, so I made sure that that was on top. So from the bottom of that buttonhole that we just drew, figure out an equal measurement that you're going to have between each button. For me, I think that was about 3 inches, so I measured down 3 inches, popped a dot there, placed my button there, and then popped another dot below that, drew a line for the buttonhole, and just repeated that process until I filled the whole center of the garment. Again, if you have the button foot and the button setting on your machine, go ahead and use that and fill in all your buttonholes. Or if you're like me, we're then going to switch our machine to a zigzag setting. I tend to use a thicker zigzag setting for the top and the bottom, and a thinner zigzag setting for the two edges, and essentially you just sew above the line and below the line with a thicker setting, and then finish the frame off with the two thinner edges on either side. Repeat that for all of the buttonholes, and then we will grab our seam ripper or our fabric scissors and just essentially chop open the center of that buttonhole, and obviously make sure that your buttons actually fit in there. If not, make any adjustments if need be. Repeat that process for your cuffs as well, and then it is time to now add our buttons on. Lay down your jacket and overlap the buttonhole pretty much where it will be sitting on top of on your jacket. Grab your pencil, fabric chalk or whatever, and reach through that hole and pop a mark to the bit of fabric that sits underneath where the button will be sitting, and that will help us indicate where the button is going to be placed. Once you've popped a dot in all of those places, we will then thread a hand needle, tie a few knots about 3 inches or enough to leave a bit of a tail end along this thread, and we will start hand threading from the underside of the jacket up through this dot that we have marked out. Pop the button on top of that and continue the process of going in and out of the button until you feel like it is nice and secure and in place. You then finish on the underside and just tie the thread, trim up any excess, and that is essentially adding your button on. Finished adding all these buttons on while I was watching the OC, so it is a great multitasking event if you would enjoy to do that yourself. California. And then I believe that means we have a finished jacket ready to throw on. I know I say this about everything, but honestly, I have not taken this off since I made it. I also like that I did make it this oversized fit because I can layer up underneath it, wear some jeans and a shirt, wear a dress, wear a skirt. So many ways to style it. If you did follow along and you enjoyed this tutorial, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and also subscribe if you would like to see more tutorials like this. I've got so many more in the works for you guys. Hope it all made sense, and I hope wherever you are, you have a lovely day, and I will see you guys in the upcoming videos. Time to style this baby and add it to my wardrobe.